After 7 years of dating, Felix still calls out the name of his unrequited love, Annie, when he's drunk. He begs me not to leave him, and I meekly agree, taking off his hearing aid and calling him Howard, the man he believes I love with all my heart. But then the real Howard, who supposedly died 7 years ago, suddenly reappears. Felix accuses me of never loving him, and I calmly thank him for the $5 million he gave me to find Howard. The news of Annie's divorce spreads back to our country the same day Felix and I are at the hospital for his checkup. His hearing won't recover, and he still can't walk. But upon hearing that the person who caused all this trouble is back in the country, a glimmer of joy appears in Felix's eyes. That night, drunk, he holds my hand and pleads for me, mistaking me for Annie. When he realizes his mistake, he hurls a blanket at me, accusing me of trying to be someone I'm not. The humiliation triggers memories of the past when Felix's crush Annie destroyed my artwork and my dreams, but Felix found me and offered me money, looking down on me as he did. Even though Felix despised me back then, we ended up getting married 2 years later. On my 20th birthday, Howard, whom everyone believed was dead, disappeared at sea while trying to rescue hostages. I spiraled into despair until I saw a blurry photo that hinted at his survival. Desperate for money to find Howard, I accepted Felix's financial help after Annie left him. When Annie finally returned, Felix brought her to me and revealed that we were married. Seeing me, Annie couldn't believe it and lashed out at me, questioning Felix's choice. Felix assured her that I was just a stand-in, not to be taken seriously. Annie poured hot water on me in front of Felix, who remained indifferent, showing his tolerance towards her outburst. The next morning, Felix transferred $50,000 to my account as compensation for Annie's actions. I accepted it without complaint, a far cry from my rebellious teenage self. When Felix remarked on my change in demeanor, I simply replied that people change. That evening, Felix hosted a dinner in honor of Annie, using his connections to pave her way after she married abroad and left their country. During the banquet, Annie's old rival Ray suddenly stood up with a wine glass in hand. "Annie, aren't you supposed to be out there being a princess for the royal family? How come you slinked back like a mourning dog?" Annie's face turned pale in an instant. Ray had someone bring a bottle of strong liquor and pushed it toward her, saying, "I know Felix's true intentions for tonight's party. Annie, if you finish this bottle, we can call it even between us. You're planning to develop your career in the country anyway, maybe I can lend a hand," he continued. Annie's eyes welled up with tears. She looked at Felix, tears on the brink of falling. "This is hard liquor, I will die if I drink it." "Felix, didn't you promise to protect me forever?" Felix reassuringly held her hand, looking at Ray. "Annie used to be stubborn and indeed offended you before, so it's normal for you to want to vent. Why don't you have someone else drink this as a gesture of apology to Ray?" Felix paused and looked at me. "Joan, go ahead, drink it, and then apologize to Ray." Ray lounged lazily, leaning against the chair, with a smug expression. "I have no objection if your wife agrees." The wound on my face hadn't fully healed. The doctor had expressly cautioned me against drinking. I sat frozen in my chair, gripping my slightly trembling wrist, silently locking eyes with Felix. He calmly said, "Later, I'll have my assistant transfer $1 million to you." The atmosphere stagnated for a moment. I stood up, picked up the bottle, and drank it down. The burning sensation of the strong liquor spread from my throat to my nostrils. The intense alcoholic fumes surged up, choking me and causing tears to flow uncontrollably. Ray's cronies clapped and cheered. "Great tolerance, a true heroine among women." Ray mocked, "Felix's wife loves money so much. Was she born poor in her past life?" There was a tone of sarcasm in his voice. After finishing the drink, I placed the bottle down and bent deeply before Ray. "Ray, I have offended you before, please forgive me." Ray toyed with the glass in his hand, smiling. $1 million, Felix is quite generous. "All right, Annie, let's consider our grievances settled." Under Felix's protection, nobody brought up Annie's embarrassing divorce anymore. They all praised her. It was said that Annie was a world-famous painter and artist overseas. One of her works was sought after with a high price tag. Even royals from various countries were competing to bid for it. Annie was very pleased, elegantly smiling. You all are too generous. I just have a bit of talent in painting. She was allergic to alcohol, so I was the one to help her avoid it that night. I had to run to the bathroom to vomit several times. Ended up with rashes all over my neck. As I was heading back, I overheard some people whispering. Was the woman with Annie Felix's wife? She looks a lot like her. Wife? She's just a servant. Selling herself to a family as a stand-in for money, willing to give up her identity. I bet this knockoff will soon be kicked out of the door. A few of them laughed with disdain in their eyes. I broke out in a cold sweat, leaning against the wall in the corridor to catch my breath. I took out my phone. Felix had transferred another $1 million. I hung Moonlight in the Wilderness at the art exhibition. Annie was not in a good mood, don't blame her. I knew. Lately, she's been holding an art exhibition. Someone offered a high price, wanting her to paint another piece similar to Moonlight in the Wilderness. But that wasn't Annie's painting. It was from that night when I was 17, after the call with Howard. I stayed up all night and created the work. Later, I sold it for $20,000 to raise money. It was after marrying Felix that I found out he was the anonymous buyer. The wind in the wilderness took a shape, the moonlight shone equally on every piece of land. That was something Annie, a base person, could never paint. In the 7th year, I finally tracked down the photographer of that photo. Do you know where he is now? He shook his head. Seeing my disappointed face, he hesitated before lowering his voice. Actually, 6 months ago, I photographed that person again. I froze. But the place where it was taken is very dangerous. If I reveal it to you, I'll have to leave immediately and go overseas. If you want, you'll have to pay a high price. I was $200,000 short of the money I had. Back in the country, I found Felix. Before he could speak, Annie next to him laughed. How shameless of you, do you really think you're worth that much? I ignored her, just staring firmly at Felix. Felix, whatever you want, feel free to ask. He met my gaze of desperation and said with a slight pause, Joan, Annie's not happy lately, I want to cheer her up. This matter, let her decide. Annie looked at me, smiled leisurely. Joan, aren't you the one who's always believed your talent is superior to mine? And you look down on us wealthy people the most, right? You want money, well, then kneel down and beg me. When I knelt in front of her, my lips were cut with bloodstains. Annie suddenly burst into laughter. You really believed it, how naive. She bent her eyes, deceiving you. Back then, when you broke your hand, your brother also went to my uncle the same way, saying he'd bring me to justice. He didn't know, I sat next door, watching the drama unfold. Your brother, just like you, is a base person who is naive to the point of folly. Heard he's dead? Well, that's true. She bent slightly, her smile sweet as if a poisonous flower bloomed, alluring and unimaginable justice served. That tense string in my mind suddenly snapped. When I came to, I was grabbing her hair, pressing her tightly against the table. Biting her shoulder, almost tearing off a piece of flesh. Annie had never experienced such pain, tears streaming down her face. But she was too pampered to resist my strength. Joan, are you mad? She struggled to push me away, hysterically calling me a mad dog. Finally, Felix in his wheelchair called the butler and servants over. With a cold face, for the first time, he dropped his gentle mask in front of me. Joan, you've been married to me for 7 years, but you still don't know what decency is. It's because I treated you too well, made you lose your sense of proportion. When they forcibly pulled me away, my mouth was full of blood. Annie was close to losing it. She slapped me twice and then directed others to drag me into the bathroom. The bathtub was filled with cold water. My face was pushed into it, water rushing into my nostrils and eyes, causing aching shivers and spasms. Just as I was near suffocation, I was yanked up by my hair. Plunged back in. In the seconds before losing consciousness, I thought, was it the same for Howard when he fell into the sea? Was it the same despair? Did he think of me? Annie went too far. Eventually, I was rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. A severe illness. As compensation, Felix transferred $3 million to me. He said, "More than what you asked for, so stop making a scene, Joan." I couldn't be bothered to argue with him, just sent the money over, hoping to obtain that photo. However, the money was refunded. The photographer's account was closed. I sat blankly in the hospital. The sunlight, like falling gold, shining through the window onto me. But I couldn't feel any warmth. I don't know how much time had passed when the door of the ward was knocked. I looked up to see a middle-aged man with a serious expression. On the day of discharge, he led me into an inconspicuous secret building. "It's very dangerous, don't look for Howard anymore, we can't reach him now," he said. "Whether he's alive or not, in just a month, we'll have an answer." I gazed at him blankly. "So, he's not dead?" "He didn't before, now I can't be sure. His mission is high risk, we lost contact with him a week ago." Tears welled in my eyes, and I shakily asked, "Why didn't he let you tell me?" "Howard knew you were married, that you'd wed Felix," he replied, "so as not to disturb you. Letting you believe he died 7 years ago." Leaving the small building, the sky darkened. I looked into the deepening twilight, feeling like fate played a huge joke on me. On my way back, Felix was waiting in the villa's yard in his wheelchair. Seeing me, he inquired coolly, "Where did you go from the hospital?" "Joan. Are you angry with me?" I looked at his haughty face, harboring hidden displeasure. It was only slightly reminiscent of Howard's face, sharp and stern, having weathered storms of bullets. Just that little resemblance saved me from suffocating despair. But after today, it seemed like nothing had any meaning. I passed by him numbly, paying no mind. However, my wrist was grabbed. If it was about Annie's incident, I admit I sided with her a bit. His tone softened deliberately. "As if making a grand concession, as compensation, I'll have my assistant transfer you some money again. Stop causing trouble." I remained silent, gazing at the setting sun in the distance as daylight faded gradually. When night fell, I calmly said, "Felix, let's divorce." He frowned, warning me, "All these years, I've spoiled you, making you forget your place. Who else will give someone like you so much money if you leave me?" I covered my face and smiled. "What's the use of money to me?" "Useless? How did you kneel to beg me before, forgotten?" I didn't listen, just placed the drafted divorce agreement in his study. I moved out of Felix's house. Days passed. A month later, I received an invitation from the former orphanage to attend their charity gala. These days, Felix initially thought I was throwing a tantrum, didn't want to give in to me. Later, he seemed to realize that I was serious. He started lowering himself to appease me. "Don't argue with me anymore, Joan. You're back, I'll have Annie personally apologize to you." I didn't reply. On the day of the charity event, I walked onto the stage and immediately saw Felix in the audience. He was looking at me intently. The host asked me, "I heard that Ms. Joan grew up in this welfare home and has made donations several times." "Yes, I want to make sure the kids here have a better life. This is what Howard has been doing since he graduated." When he left, the task was handed over to me. "As far as I know, Ms. Joan has a brother who grew up here with her, doing something amazing, named Howard." When I heard Howard's name, I froze suddenly. My gaze swept the room, settling in a dark corner of the venue. My heart, nestled in my chest, began to beat wildly. After a long pause, I found my voice again. "He's not a brother. He's not my brother. Howard is 6 years older than me, but I never called him brother because I liked him. He had lost a lot of weight, his cheeks slightly sunken, his skin exposed full of wounds. But those cold, sharp eyes staring at me, bright as stars, softened in an instant. Now you've found me. I almost thought I was still dreaming. It wasn't until Howard's warm fingertips touched mine. His voice was completely different from 7 years ago, hoarse, slightly hoarse, as if his vocal cords had been damaged by something. I remembered the words of that middle-aged man. For 7 years, he had been on a very dangerous mission. Tears surged uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Joan," he said softly, turning to the audience. "I am Howard, and I have been raised in the welfare home for as far as I can remember. The children here are not of noble birth, but they can still contribute to society. I thank you all for your generosity on their behalf." He bowed deeply. As he straightened up, he suddenly couldn't stop coughing, a line of blood spilling from his lips. It was at that moment that I realized how badly he was injured. He had rushed here so urgently to see me. After the charity event, Howard was taken to the hospital. I was about to follow, but Felix's assistant suddenly intercepted me. She said, "Madam, Felix wants to see you." I frowned, correcting her. "I'm divorced from Felix. I haven't signed the divorce agreement, so technically we're still married." Felix's voice rang out. I followed his gaze and saw Felix sitting in a wheelchair, looking up at me. In his usually haughty and cool eyes, there was a hint of panic. "Joan, come back to me. What you said in front of so many people, I can let it go." I smirked. "Who needs your forgiveness? He's back. I don't need to dig money from you to find him anymore." "Excuse me, I need to go to the hospital to see him." I sounded rude because I was anxious to see Howard. Felix's face showed a ridiculous hint of sadness. Turning red-eyed, he asked me, "Have you never loved me?" "Of course not." He closed his eyes. "For these 7 years, you stayed by my side, willingly acting as Annie's substitute, enduring everything without complaints. Isn't it because you love me? Joan, do you have a heart at all?" I just felt absurd. "You've treated me like a servant, let Annie torture me. The compensation you gave me was just the price of a bag for Annie. I've been obedient and disgusting in front of you for 7 years. You haven't even shown me basic respect, Felix. You should be grateful that you're really rich, otherwise I wouldn't have chosen you to dig money from." He seemed so fragile. After being said a few words like that, tears were about to fall. I left Felix and walked away. This time, his assistant didn't stop me again. When I arrived at the hospital ward, Howard was already receiving intravenous fluids. His body was covered in countless wounds, some of which were even festering. I managed to escape back by boat, Howard whispered to me, explaining that after obtaining crucial evidence, he was exposed, and they chased him all the way, not wanting him to bring the things back to our country. I couldn't use a phone card or the internet, or they would trace me through GPS. I had to rely solely on memories from 7 years ago to find the doc, Howard explained in just a few sentences, already painting a thrilling picture. My heart felt like it was clenched into a knot as I struggled to ask, "What about now? You're appearing at a public fundraising event like this, won't it?" "Of course not," Howard interrupted, gently placing his hand on mine. "I'm back now, it's safe." I bit my lip, nodded, and couldn't bear to take my eyes off him for a moment. I've been thinking about him for so long. Under my gaze, he suddenly pulled me into a tight embrace. "It must have been tough, Joan. I'm sorry, for these 7 years." His voice, which was once clear and pleasant, was now hoarse and unpleasant. I asked, "Why has your voice changed like this?" His hand holding mine tensed slightly. I said, "Howard, don't keep things from me anymore." "All right," he paused and then softly said, 5 years ago, after they used me for drug trials, it became like this. A long time ago, I was lured into a house by the former director of the orphanage with a piece of candy. He then tipped off the police. During that time, I just stared blankly at the sky with no expression on my face. Howard would stay with me, singing softly in my ear. The doctor suggested I try something to reignite my interest in the world after the trauma. My first set of painting supplies was obtained by Howard hustling out to shine shoes for someone. My first painting was of me and Howard under the big banyan tree in the orphanage. He's been a part of my life, inseparable presence for these 7 years. I've never stopped thinking about you. With my face buried in his shoulder, tears streamed down my face. Don't leave me again. I thought you would live well after marrying that person, Howard said, It's my fault, Joan, I shouldn't have made you worry like this. But we can't be together. I suddenly looked up at him, staring blankly. All these years, I've only seen you as a sister. He gently touched my hair as he did many years ago. Although I had biases against that person, if he treated you well during the 7 years of marriage, don't lie to me. I interrupted him, I know you more than you think, Howard. When you lie, your ears turn red with nervousness, and you dare not look into my eyes. Howard suddenly stopped. He looked at me quietly, his eyes, which should have been sharp, now resembled serene and gentle lake waters, filled with sorrow. You've always been a brave and just person in my eyes, he said. Those drugs not only ruined my vocal cords, Joan, I touched radium without any protection. I read a book a long time ago called The Radium Girls. At the beginning of the 20th century, those dial painters who touched radium. Even 100 years after their death, their bones still emitted a faint blue light in the soil. It was the deathly light brought by the radioactive element radium. Why did Howard come into contact with it? About half a month later, I finally found out the answer. 7 years ago, when he went to rescue the hostages kidnapped by pirates, he fell into the ocean but was fortunately rescued. He accidentally learned some crucial information. Many people who vanished without a trace in our country during these years were somehow connected to a top-secret human drug testing laboratory abroad. He got in touch with our authorities, and after negotiation, it was decided that he'd find a way to stay there as an undercover agent. Because the incident was too big, this mission was eventually classified as the highest level of secrecy. Without telling anyone, I watched our country's citizens being deceived into high-paying jobs and excitedly becoming guinea pigs for those people. The consequences of using those drugs on people are unimaginable to the average person. Howard clenched his teeth, his expression pained, and countless times, I wanted to pull out a gun and kill them. But I couldn't. For many years, he was the only one successful in infiltrating the laboratory. For this, he even paid the price of exposure to nuclear radiation. All to bring down those demons. The turmoil in the following months was not something an ordinary person like me could touch. Because of the secrecy agreement, even Howard wasn't fully informed. I only watched the news on TV while accompanying him in the hospital for treatment. It reported that our police, through years of effort, had obtained crucial evidence. They busted several large groups colluding with foreign laboratories in secret and arrested multiple powerful accomplices. They rescued hundreds of citizens who had disappeared over these years. Some were tormented by drugs, and some had already been laid to rest in foreign lands. I was luckier than them. Such missions were originally a matter of life and death. Howard coughed up blood, calmly wiped it away, and looked at me. If I really died there, as long as I could bring back the evidence and the list, there wouldn't be much for me to worry about. Except for you. Because the information kept leaking, they'd suspect me every now and then. To prove my loyalty, I'd voluntarily ask to be a drug trial subject. When I touched radium, my body didn't actually feel anything. It's just that I suddenly thought of you in my heart. In my memory, Howard wasn't a talkative person. But during this time in the hospital, he talked to me a lot, as if trying to fill the 7 years of emptiness. The day Howard was discharged from the hospital, I was stopped in the small garden downstairs. Felix was still sitting in his wheelchair, looking somewhat cold. Joan, I've let you go on for too long. It's time for you to go home, he said. I furrowed my brows. We are already divorced. I haven't signed the divorce agreement. He put on that annoyingly fake, gentle mask again. I have a business banquet tonight and you, as my wife, should accompany me. Everyone is eager to meet my wife, they say. Let Annie accompany you. Felix softened his tone. I know you've been jealous of Annie. But now, her gallery business no longer needs my help, and she promised not to bother you anymore. I didn't want to argue with him, so I turned and walked away. Suddenly, Felix said, Joan, even if I initially saw you as a substitute for Annie, what about you? Aren't you treating me as a substitute for that Howard? I turned around abruptly. In the blood-red glow of the setting sun, his expression seemed to show a hint of vulnerability. I took a deep breath. Felix, can you stop trying to paint yourself in a favorable light? Who do you think you are, to be his substitute? As I said this, I suddenly noticed Felix looking past me coldly. So I turned my head and saw Howard. He changed out of his hospital gown into a sharp suit, hiding all the wounds that wouldn't scab over. His face lacked color, lips were pale, and there was a sharpness in his eyes and eyebrows. Though thin, he looked like a drawn weapon. The warm evening light didn't reach him, completely cutting off the sharp and chilling aura he emitted. Compared to Felix across from him, full of self-importance and eternal arrogance, they seemed like two different kinds of people. I was right. Felix didn't even deserve to be compared to him. Mr. Felix, Howard came over, holding my hand and looking down at Felix in the wheelchair. I may not have your wealth and power, but I know two lawyers. Luke arranged the invitation for me, as Howard mentioned on our way there. I hesitated, feeling uneasy. Is there any danger? No, just need to confirm something, he reassured, smiling as he ruffled my hair. Stop worrying, we're already out of the hospital. It could be good for you to relax and keep me company. The banquet hall was magnificent. In the previous 7 years, I had accompanied Felix to such occasions countless times, meeting all kinds of people. But my heart had always been stagnant. I didn't feel a shred of joy holding Howard's hand at this moment. The guests at the banquet were from various industries. Howard introduced me to some people he knew. That was when I learned some of the hostages he rescued from pirates on the cruise ship had wealthy families, who were grateful to Howard. After exchanging greetings, we turned around and unexpectedly ran into Ray and his group of friends. He whistled at me, "Isn't this Felix's wife? Heard you two are getting a divorce. Do you still need money? Have another glass of wine, and I'll give you $1 million to hire a lawyer." Ray was halfway through his laughter when he suddenly stopped, looking like a choked chicken with no voice. That was because Howard casually picked up a dinner knife from the nearby table and rested it against Ray's neck. Ray's eyes showed a mix of shock and anger. "Do you know who I am?" he blurted out. "Do you know who I am?" Howard countered, making Ray uncertain. "You don't know which family's son you are?" "I don't," Howard smiled slightly. "It's normal for a dying person to want someone to go with them. Spoiled young masters like Ray fear nothing, except people who disregard life and death." With his friends, Ray discreetly made his exit. I stared at Howard. "Don't talk about dying next time. The doctors say your physical decline is slowing down, and some wounds are showing signs of healing." He sighed faintly, "My bad. I'm sorry, Joan." After he returned, he said sorry to me 1,000 times. But he couldn't change the inevitable outcome. I sniffed back my emotions. "I just want you to be a little happier while you're alive," Howard promised me. He went to get me a small cake, but in the crowd, he disappeared from my sight. As I scanned the room, a tide of anxiety gripped me. I wanted to find Howard, but Felix appeared again, persistent. He looked at me. "Joan, if I apologize for what happened before, and make it up to you, would you come back to me?" "No, I wouldn't," I said firmly. Felix's eyelashes trembled, showing some pain. "Joan, I regret it. I never admitted it, but I fell in love with you when I bought that painting, Desolate Moonlight." I cut him off, "But Desolate Moonlight wasn't a painting for you. You don't even deserve its meaning." In the 5th year of our marriage, one late night, Felix had some drinks and suddenly held my hand. Because of the old wound left by Annie, my pinky finger curled slightly. He sighed, "These hands can't paint anymore, it's a bit of a shame." I withdrew my hand, covered it with my sleeve, and said flatly, "It's just my bad luck. You should look at Annie's recent paintings, they're really good." He smiled, "You're right." He brushed over everything that ruined my career lightly. Now, he's confessing his cheap affection to me again. "But I really do love you, Joan. It's just, I grew up with Annie, and I'm just so used to seeing her." I tuned out the rest of his confessions. Because Howard finally walked in from the corridor outside the door, approaching me. I lifted my skirt and hurriedly ran towards him, without even glancing back at Felix. And so, I didn't see the somewhat menacing look he gave me from behind. On the way back, I asked Howard, "Did you find what you were looking for?" He nodded, feeling sorry. "Sorry, Joan, I came here to cheer you up, but ended up ruining your mood for the party." I didn't have a good mood to begin with in a place like this. I hooked my finger around Howard's, whispering, "Howard, don't think that coming back would ruin anything. This wasn't the life I ever wanted. I've been in this world for 7 years and never once felt like I belonged. I always think of Howard, and that moon when I was 17. I've always belonged in a world with him in it. You don't need to feel guilty. A top-secret mission with such broad implications cannot afford any mistake. It's right that you didn't tell me. If the mission fails, I would take full responsibility for it. As for marrying Felix, that was my choice, my consequences to bear. It has nothing to do with you." Pausing for a moment, I lowered my voice. "Bro, I've grown up. I'm not the little kid who broke the principal's vase and had you come to my rescue. I'm not the young girl who cried her heart out in your arms when she lost a finger at 18. Back then, facing the class represented by Felix and Annie, we felt so powerless. Thankfully, it's all in the past." Howard chuckled. "Remember the charity gala where you said you only needed me? Who used to follow me around calling me bro all the time?" I blinked. "Things are different now. I have different feelings for you. But if you really want to hear me calling you that at certain moments, I can do that too. Bro." I stopped in my tracks, turned around, stood on tiptoes, held his face, and kissed him. "I want to kiss you." The moonlight that night was so gentle. The night wind rustled through the branches and leaves. Howard didn't push me away. His body tensed for a moment, but after I bit his lip in annoyance, he finally hugged me and took charge. He never wore cologne. Only the scent of laundry powder mixed with a faint hint of blood. I remembered his wounds and mumbled vaguely, "Don't press on the wound. It's fine." Howard held me tighter. "A little pain is all right." In a way, Howard and I were the same. We both confirm our existence in each other's world through pain. This long kiss ended in gasps. On the dark tar road, our shadows merged into one whole, just like many years ago, when I ran away from the orphanage and got lost halfway, walking closely with him. I actually went to see a doctor last month. He said my hands may not fully recover, but with some treatment, I could still hold a paintbrush again. I said, "I have so many inspirations, so many things I want to paint. I want to show them to you. So, as long as we're alive, every day of our future will be worth looking forward to." That night, I truly believed that Howard and I would have a future. But fate is always unpredictable. A month later, someone else went missing. And all signs indicated that the missing persons case was eerily similar to hundreds before. We all miscalculated. That case wasn't closed as we thought. Howard, with a solemn face, stood in the sunlight shining through the window and looked at me. "Joan, that evening at the banquet, I was there on a mission. And I saw someone who should never have been there. I had a bad feeling in my heart, who should never have been there." Howard gazed deeply into my eyes after a long silence. He whispered, "He should have been executed 2 months ago." Howard started going out early and returning late for his missions again. And I started picking up the paintbrush again. It felt awkward at first after so long, the trembling in my hands causing wobbly lines. But as I got used to it, I quickly regained the feeling of those years. Moonlight in the Wilderness was bought by Felix. I wanted to paint it again, the moonlight and the wind of when I was 17. Before I could finish it, Howard's mission took a big turn. He didn't tell me the specifics. Just handed me a photo with a fierce look in his eyes. We've been undercover for 7 years, yet we still couldn't completely shut down this human trafficking route. He said, or rather, if one side is eliminated, the other will take the chance and resurface. In this world, there are always places where the sun can't reach. One darkness vanishes, another one fills in, but I never expected that the person in that photo would be Annie. I haven't seen her for a long time. Just heard about her occasionally. They say her art exhibition has gone international, opening a gallery abroad, becoming a hugely successful artist. But within half a year, she's risen to fame. Now recognized as a talented female artist by everyone. Selling paintings is just a front, she's leveraging this fame to make connections abroad. Howard is getting busier. The deeper he digs, the more chilling truths surface. But due to the high-intensity work, his health has deteriorated even more. The cells and metabolism that were already damaged by radioactive substances are decaying at a rate far beyond normal. It's not just Annie, it's also the Smith. His icy tone suggests that the Smith's leader Felix has been involved in illegal activities for the past 6 months. After Annie returned, he used her connections overseas to link up with the mysterious organization she got to know abroad. As Howard paused here, his voice suddenly stopped. He turned his head, coughing violently. The room gradually filled with a bloody smell, pulling my heartstrings as the scent lingered in the air. Nonchalantly wiping away the blood from his lips, he continued, "We have gathered some evidence. All we need is for them to make contact next time, and we can take them down in one fell swoop." Outside the window, a torrential rain poured down. Thick dark clouds covered the sky. After a while, a faint golden light swayed and floated down through the cracks in the clouds. I still remember it was just an ordinary morning. Before Howard left, I relentlessly begged him for a kiss. Despite living together for so long, our relationship never progressed beyond this. He said, "Until everything is settled, I can't touch you, Joan, not until I'm sure I can make you happy." I was quite upset and even said a few harsh words. These few rare moments of stubbornness in me were all indulged by him, and he helplessly indulged it again. And because of that, when a black sedan suddenly stopped by the roadside and pulled me inside, I didn't even react before passing out in the pungent smell of ether. When I woke up, I saw Felix. "See, Joan, where can your beloved Howard be better than me?" He smiled at me, explaining that to rescue a group of strangers about to be taken aboard a ship, he had to forsake you, forsake the chance to keep you safe. How could his men have the opportunity to take you away when he's always by your side? In that instant, I understood many things. When Annie first returned, her reputation wasn't good. And to think, she had abandoned Felix, who got hurt for her, to marry abroad. For someone like Felix, who has always been in a position of power, why would he continue to help her without regard for the past, 7 years after being left behind? After understanding this, I chuckled softly. That's the part where you can never beat Howard. Justice and courage are integral to Howard's character. That's the kind of person I've always admired him to be. Felix's face turned completely cold. That night, Annie arrived. From their argument, I learned that Howard had set up a trap, deliberately relaxing surveillance at various docks and airports. After a while, allowing their men to hurriedly transfer goods to the ship, which backfired. I didn't expect their move to be so bold this time. It seemed they were determined to uproot us completely. Annie's once beautiful face now looked distorted in anger. She glanced at me, froze suddenly. "Why did you bring her here? Don't you know they're scouring the city for her now?" Felix, unfazed, said, "I want to take her with me." Annie stared at him in disbelief. "Are you out of your mind, Felix? Bringing just a knockoff along will only make our escape harder." Felix, unchanged facial expression. "I like her, so I want her to come with us." In the following days, Felix locked me in a secret villa. The rescued hostages were all witnesses, and it was only a matter of time before they pinned the two masterminds down. So, they began planning their escape. A significant portion of Howard's assets had already been transferred overseas. That evening, after a few drinks, Felix wheeled over to me, his eyes glazed, saying, "The divorce process isn't complete yet, we are still married. Joan, once we're out of the country, we can start anew. After 7 years of unwavering companionship from you, I won't treat you as I did before. I'll spend the rest of my life making up for past mistakes." He rarely spoke so much to me, all about beautiful dreams for the future. But I just looked at him coldly the whole time. Maybe feeling provoked, Felix suddenly brought up, Howard has been looking for you." Unfortunately, he has no direct evidence to prove that I took you away. Besides, he's scared that if he pushes too hard, I'll destroy the evidence he's been longing for. I bit my tongue and forced my brain to stay alert. Finally, I said the first thing tonight, what evidence? Felix looked at me and smiled faintly, a list, an account book. Unfortunately, he could never get his hands on them. Tonight, I'll even allow you to shed a tear for Howard, who is close to death. In the following days, he and Annie were busy preparing to escape abroad. And I was locked in a small windowless room, pondering ways to get my hands on the list and account book he mentioned. Felix had always held himself in high regard and never bothered to lie to me. The evidence he mentioned must be very important. I started creating opportunities in this room. After 2 consecutive days of high fever, Felix brought in his trusted private doctor to give me an 4 and moved me to the bedroom. When the fever didn't go down, I felt a hand gently stroking my hair. "Joan, being ill won't help, I won't let you go," Felix said. Trembling, I opened my eyes with an unusual flush on my pale face. "Stop being cheap, Felix." He chuckled, surprisingly, "I prefer you like this now than when you were submissive before. You were born with a silver spoon in your mouth, had an easy life till this age. Who wronged you? Why did you harm your own kind, do such despicable things?" Felix continued, "Doctors both here and abroad say my legs can't be cured, but I want to stand up. They promised me, as long as they conduct enough extreme experiments on those people, they can develop a completely safe drug." Before I could say anything, car lights flashed outside the window. He answered a call and his expression changed instantly. "The police are coming, they'll be here soon," he coldly called Annie. "Pack up, we need to leave now, there's a boat waiting for us at the pier." Annie exclaimed, "The stuff in the room isn't packed yet, what about those paintings?" "Burn them," he said emotionlessly, "except for Moonlight in the Wilderness, leave everything else behind." Annie gave me a hateful look that seemed to penetrate my soul. As dawn began to break, they finally finished packing everything. Seeing me silently staring at the painting, Felix lowered his eyes and softened his tone. "Joan, if you like it, you can continue painting once we get to a safe place." I glanced at him without a word. As a small flame started blazing from the villa's curtains, growing more intense, Annie pushed me into a black business van. Just as the van door was about to close, I suddenly pushed her away and jumped out of the car. But after running a few steps, a loud gunshot rang out. A bullet pierced through my shoulder. The explosion of flesh and blood brought intense burning pain, making me break into a cold sweat in seconds, struggling to stay on my feet. "Joan, come back." Felix looked at me through the van window, his eyes piercing. "Do you really want to risk your life like this? Come back now, I'll have someone treat your wound, we won't hold the past against you," he proposed. "Who needs you to pardon the past?" I held back the intense pain in my shoulder, forced a smile. "Let your people kill me, I won't go with you." Annie screamed, "Do you think I won't dare to kill you? Felix, if you keep dragging this out with her, the boat will leave soon. She's just trying to buy time until that damn cop arrives." "He shouldn't die," I said, "you two should." Felix looked somewhat sad. "Joan, you'd rather die than go with me?" "Yes," I nodded without hesitation. Throughout, my tightly clenched left hand was hidden behind my skirt. Without him noticing, I had managed to retrieve something he desperately wanted to conceal from the frame of the Moonlight in the Wilderness. Inside the frame was a small USB drive, no bigger than the tip of a pinky finger, with cold, metallic edges and a sheen. It contained crucial evidence for the entire case. I couldn't turn back because behind me was Felix and Annie, planning to defect with weapons. I couldn't escape to any possible way out, as their armed men could kill me and discover the evidence in my possession. I only had one way. They only did things hidden from the light, always seeking shelter in the darkness, unable to step into the sunlight. I turned and ran toward the fiery scene, illuminating half the sky red. As the second bullet pierced through my back, I crossed over the raging flames. The fire climbed along the hem of my skirt, causing blisters on my calves. I turned back, waving gently at Felix across the flickering flames, silently saying, "You can't escape." Goodbye. The temperature was too high, the metal in my hand grew hotter, even melting at the edges, so I opened my mouth and swallowed it. The scorching metal slid down my throat, sinking into the safest depths of my body. I believed Howard would arrive soon. He would definitely find it. Howard's epilogue. Upon receiving the intelligence, Howard and his comrades hurried to the scene. The entire villa was on the verge of collapse in a raging fire when they arrived. His face pale, Howard felt his heart pounding in his chest. The fire was extinguished, leaving everything reduced to ashes. One of his comrades hesitantly approached him and took a deep breath, saying, "We found a body in the fire." It felt like a heavy hammer striking his chest as Howard suddenly felt dizzy. A suffocating sensation slowly engulfed him, taking a long time for him to react. It was the pain of something shattering into pieces in his heart. Howard was nearly killed by this pain. He staggered over and saw Joan on the bathroom floor, curled up like a baby, arching her back to protect her stomach as much as possible. The faint traces on the floor were like a painting. Having known each other for nearly 20 years, Howard quickly understood the meaning behind the scene. As they retrieved evidence by dissecting her body, his comrade tightly held Howard's shoulder, saying, "We will make sure all the culprits face justice, to honor her sacrifice." The information on the flash drive was comprehensive, likely prepared by Felix for his escape plan. It included a list of people involved, detailed accounts, and fund allocations. The identity of each person was laid bare. Felix and Annie were arrested as the ship sailed into international waters. Faced with irrefutable evidence, their defense seemed feeble. Their actions over the past few years, the leaked information, the betrayal of their compatriots, were enough to condemn them repeatedly. The internal unrest lasted for a full 2 months. To the unsuspecting public, it seemed like a few companies had collapsed, and there were some new faces in the news. But Howard knew better. The dark cloud that had loomed for over a decade had finally dissipated. He had often thought that he was willing to pay any price, even his life, for this outcome. But it couldn't include Joan's life. When he was 7 on a rainy day, Joan was abandoned at the orphanage's doorstep. He carried her back to show the deputy director, who then decided to adopt her. For Howard, it held a special significance. From a small child to growing up, she had become like a reed in the wind touched by light, soft yet incredibly resilient. He later learned that during the 7 perilous years when his life was constantly threatened, Joan endured the same suffering. At one moment, he almost wanted to ignore the law and go kill Felix and Annie. When they destroyed her hand initially and later treated her like a toy after he left, it was Luke who stopped him. With a firm grip on his shoulder, Luke's tone was grave and solemn. "Another person has gone missing. I suspect the Smiths are involved," Luke said. His suspicion was correct. After the previous powers were overthrown, Felix took advantage and allied with foreign forces through Annie. In court, Felix and Annie were sentenced to death immediately. The marriage between the plaintiff, Joan, and the defendant, Felix, was dissolved on the spot. As Felix looked up, he saw Howard in the plaintiff's seat. His eyes reflected deep hatred and undisguised murderous intent. On the day of Felix and Annie's execution, Howard bought a bouquet of white roses. Carrying Joan's unfinished painting, he went to the cemetery. She had real talent. He bought the missing paints but couldn't recreate the connecting strokes. "Joan, you were supposed to become a world-renowned artist." During the autopsy, they found 2 bullets embedded in her body. The little girl who used to fear pain so much endured gunshot wounds and the burning agony of flames, swallowing hot metal. Howard could guess it was because of those 7 years. In her hellish task on Earth, she may have borne the pain of separation, fleeting hope, and repeated despair. Now, she was a hero worth remembering. Placing the bouquet at her gravestone, Howard lit the painting. Breathing heavily, he leaned against the gravestone, eyes downcast. The pain in his body became more pronounced, and he began to cough up blood. The remnants of radium shattered a few of his bones and destroyed his blood and cell regeneration system. Despite multiple support frames in his body, the surgical incisions refused to heal. His life had run its course. Joan, in the other world, paint for me again." Howard closed his eyes. The flames consumed the painting, burning the night sky, moonlight, ocean, and wind from 10 years ago.